Welcome to Deep Dive, a sort of personal project that I felt I had to share. I have more than 30 books in queue and probably another 30 topics that I want to learn more about. And sometimes I want to hear a summary before I invest a couple of days of deep dive. This podcast is a result of that need. With the help of some Google apps and tools, what you have here is a podcast format that is surprisingly entertaining, even if it's a bit comprehensive. For this episode, we dive into remote viewing secrets from the books of Joe McMoneagle. Sources are Remote Viewing Secrets, a Handbook, and the Stargate Chronicles Memoirs of a Psychic Spy.
Think about this for a second. A U.S. Army officer, Joseph McMoneagle. He was the first remote viewer number one for their Stargate program. And he got the Legion of Merit.
Yeah, a military medal.
For something most people would probably call, psychic powers.
Right. That one fact just it shatters a lot of assumptions, doesn't it?
It really does. And that's exactly what we want to unpack today.
Yeah, exactly. We're doing a deep dive into remote viewing, but we're trying to leave the hype and the sort of sensational stuff behind. Mm-hmm. We want to focus on, the practical side. What was it really like, especially from someone who was right there from the start? Our goal here is really to just distill the essence of it.
And our guide for this is Joseph McMoneagle himself. We're using his handbook, Remote Viewing Secrets, which is basically like a practical guide, a user manual almost.
Right.
And we're also looking at his memoir, the Stargate Chronicles, which is his personal story, his journey through that whole classified world of psychic intelligence.
And those two books together, they give you a really complete picture, I think.
How so?
Well, the handbook gives you the structure, the methods, the how-to, but the memoir, that gives you the lived experience, the challenges, the breakthroughs, the personal impact this kind of work had. It takes it beyond just theory.
Right, into the real world. Yeah. So forget the crystal balls, I guess.
Definitely.
Because according to McMoneagle, remote viewing isn't some innate magical thing you're born with. Okay, so let's start there. Based on his work, what is remote viewing?
Well, and this is fascinating. He defines it as a scientific protocol, a way to develop and extend psychic ability.
A scientific protocol. That's key, isn't it?
That's absolutely crucial because it shifts the whole conversation away from, you're either born psychic or you're not.
Right.
It frames it as a skill, something potentially learnable, which opens up research, application, ways you just don't get with purely innate talent. He really believed that ordinary people with the right approach could learn to do what psychics do.
Okay, but getting into something like psychic ability, that sounds like it could really mess with your head a bit.
Oh, definitely.
McMoneagle talks a lot about the right mental state. It's more than just trying to see things, isn't it?
Absolutely. You really have to connect this to the inner world of the viewer. That's paramount. McMoneagle stresses this very delicate balance between having healthy skepticism, a critical mind that questions things, and just becoming a believer.
Ah, okay. So don't just accept everything blindly.
Exactly. If you lose that critical edge, you kind of drift into that mystery and mythology stuff that surrounds psychic phenomena. And that's actually bad for getting accurate results.
He even mentions how this work can fundamentally change your whole worldview. If you're consistently getting information in ways that science can't quite explain, that's got to have an impact, right?
It really does. And that brings up a big question about mental resilience. McMoneagle points out that the Stargate project in its early days involved a lot of psychological testing, and they introduced people to remote viewing gradually, very deliberately.
To protect them.
Precisely. To shield them from potentially overwhelming shifts in their core beliefs. Imagine suddenly confronting information that just shatters everything you thought you knew about reality. If you're not prepared to process that, it could be damaging.
And then there's the danger of just fooling yourself.
Yeah.
Convincing yourself you're seeing something real when you're not. Self-delusion.
He's very direct about that. He calls self-delusion seriously threatening. It takes constant self-awareness to stay objective. You have to be willing to take feedback, admit when you're wrong.
So humility is key.
Absolutely. He talks about times when bad readings happened because a viewer just couldn't stay objective. Ego got in the way, or belief.
So who actually makes a good remote viewer then? Is it just anyone off the street?
Probably not. McMoneagle mentions characteristics that SRI International and the military looked for. Things like being well-liked, surprisingly. Also, people who look for unconventional solutions, who have a history of career success, which suggests competence, right?
Sure.
And being a self-starter. Someone proactive, independent. These traits kind of point towards mental stability and independent thinking.
But McMoneagle had his own ideas too, didn't he? Beyond that list, something about learning by watching and focus.
Exactly. He really highlighted the ability to learn through example, watching experienced viewers, picking up their techniques, and also the ability to reduce physical arousal level. Basically, to quiet the mind, focus intensely, shut out all the noise.
Makes sense.
And maybe surprisingly, he emphasized creativity. He said something like, someone who is very creative is already halfway toward being a good remote viewer.
Really? Why creativity?
He felt that creative instinct often helps a viewer connect with the target, describe it effectively. It's interesting, too, the Stargate founders actually used William Broad's work on psi-conducive states to help pick candidates.
Huh. So, on the flip side, who should definitely not try this?
McMoneagle's pretty clear here. People who aren't mentally stable, and anyone who might really struggle if their fundamental beliefs about reality got shaken up.
Yeah, I can see that. The information could be pretty unsettling if you're not emotionally ready.
Exactly. You need to be prepared to process it intellectually and emotionally.
Okay, so let's say you have someone with the right mindset, the right stability. How do they actually do remote viewing? McMoneagle talks about protocols and methodologies. What's the difference?
Yeah, that's an important distinction he makes. Protocols, he says, are the scientific rules.
The rules of the game.
Kind of. They're designed to govern the process, to minimize things like fraud, bias, error, to make sure the data is collected rigorously.
Okay, and methodologies?
Methodologies are more about the viewer styles, the specific techniques an individual might use within those protocols to actually get and interpret the information.
Got it. So what were some of those core scientific protocols? How do they work in practice?
Well, a fundamental one was keeping the viewer blind to the target.
Meaning they didn't know what they were trying to view.
Right, not until after the session was totally finished. They also stressed using neutral language when giving the task no leading questions or suggestions.
Makes sense.
And critically documenting everything the viewer said, drew, felt, meticulously. The idea was to let the information come through as purely as possible without the conscious mind interfering.
And what kind of targets were they looking at? Was it just like finding lost objects?
Oh, much broader than that. He talks about targeting physical or real-world things, locations, objects, people, events.
Okay.
But also non-physical targets. Things like ideas, concepts, plans, even emotions or thoughts.
Wow. Were those harder?
He does say targeting those more abstract things often yielded more varied results, less concrete.
He mentions coordinate remote viewing. That sounds very typical, military-like.
It was definitely a key method in the Stargate program. It involved using random alphanumeric coordinates, often from military maps, as the only clue to the target.
Just a string of letters and numbers.
Yeah. And what's really interesting, McMoneagle points out, is that it worked just as well as using regular map coordinates.
Which suggests they weren't just like remembering maps they'd seen before.
Exactly. It challenged that idea. It suggested something else was going on.
What about the non-outbounder protocol? What's that?
Okay, so in the standard outbounder protocol, someone would actually go to the target location.
Okay.
In the non-outbounder protocol, they wanted to isolate the viewer even more from any possible sensory input. So the target details were sealed in an opaque envelope. Only the coordinates were on the outside.
So nobody in the room knew the actual target during the session?
For research, yes. Neither the viewer nor the monitor running the session would see the contents until after everything was done and evaluated. Maximum blindness.
They also use photos as targets sometimes in research, right?
Yeah.
How do they stop those from, biasing the viewer?
Strict rules again. McMoneagle explains that target photos were never shown to the viewer until after the remote viewing has been completed and the results have been analyzed.
Completely sealed.
Sealed in opaque envelopes, identified only by code numbers, or stored securely in computer files with similar codes. No peeking beforehand.
It sounds like what you don't show the viewer is almost as important as what you do. He uses that briefcase example.
Exactly. If you show a viewer a picture of a briefcase, but you really want to know about the person carrying it,
they might just focus on the briefcase itself.
Precisely. The image could unintentionally narrow their focus, make them miss the more important stuff about the person or what they're doing. It's all about avoiding cues that limit perception too early.
Okay, let's get to the big question everyone always asks. Accuracy. How good is remote viewing? What kind of success rate did McMoneagle talk about?
Well, he's pretty realistic about it. For someone learning the ropes, he suggests expecting maybe around 50% accuracy on random targets.
Okay, 50%.
Yeah, and within that, maybe 30 to 50% of the information might be sensible, containing significant details that actually match the target.
So it's not like getting a perfect photograph every time.
Not at all. It's important to manage expectations. It's not about perfection.
And what about predicting the future? That's the classic psychic trope, right?
McMoneagle is quite cautious there. He states pretty clearly that remote viewing is generally not very good at nailing down exact timing or predicting when future events will happen.
So they might get details about a future event, but not the when.
Sometimes, yes. Descriptive bits might come through under protocol, but he definitely doesn't recommend relying on it for precise timelines.
He also seems quite critical of where people get their information about remote viewing accuracy. The media, perhaps.
Oh yeah, he calls the media the least authoritative source, mainly because they tend to grab onto sensational sound bites that get pulled way out of context.
Can you give an example?
He mentions Dr. Edwin May saying RV can provide spectacular detail about 20% of the time, about as close to a miracle as one can get. Which sounds amazing, right?
Yeah.
But taken alone, it can be easily misinterpreted or used to hype things up unrealistically. Context is everything.
And pinpointing exact locations on a map. That sounds like another tricky area. He tells that story about the kidnapped child and the trailer park.
Right. That really illustrates the difficulty. A viewer might give a fantastic description of a place, the look, the feel, specific details even.
But finding it on a map.
But finding its exact coordinates, especially if there are lots of similar places like, say, trailer parks, that's extremely hard. The general picture might be there, but that fine-grained geographic lock, often elusive.
Okay, so if it's not perfect, how does someone actually get better at it? What's the learning process like?
McMoneagle really emphasizes slowing down, slowing the mental process, paying super close attention to those first fleeting impressions.
Instead of jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. Instead of letting logic or emotions about the target take over too quickly. He also mentions the draconian CRV training system, coordinate remote viewing.
Draconian. Sounds intense.
It was apparently very rigorous, aimed at training the subconscious to deliver information directly, without the conscious mind filtering or analyzing it first. He notes that this deep training often took a lot of time and effort, outside the actual viewing sessions.
So it sounds less like being taught specific psychic tricks and more about learning to notice subtle internal signals and filtering out mental noise.
That's a really good way to put it. You're not taught, like, how to smell a remote target literally.
Right.
But through practice, you learn to recognize and interpret subtle sensory bits you might otherwise ignore. It's about learning to recognize and trust those intuitive hits while telling them apart from just imagination or what you think should be there.
So no magic bullet.
No. He's clear. There's no magic method. It just comes down to practice, 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 and paying attention.
Interesting. He also mentions noticing differences between how men and women approach viewing. Did he find one gender was better?
No, he's very explicit about that. No difference in quality, ability, or accuracy between men and women.
Not good.
But he did see some differences in their typical technique or approach, how they went about it, which he thought could be interesting for researchers studying cognitive styles.
When someone's just starting out training, what kinds of targets are best?
In the early stages, he recommends targets that are standalone, distinct, easy to tell apart from their surroundings, and well-defined, clear characteristics. That makes it easier for a beginner to latch onto the main elements and get clear feedback.
What about assumptions and logic? You'd think having more possible targets would make it harder, but he suggests that's not always true.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive maybe. But he suggests having more choices doesn't automatically hurt accuracy if the viewer lets the perceptions emerge naturally.
Without forcing it.
Right. Without trying to logically deduce the answer or letting assumptions jump in too early. The key, he says, is learning to control assumption. Don't let the rational mind take over before the intuitive stuff gets a chance.
Record keeping. Seemed obvious for learning anything, but maybe extra important here.
Absolutely critical. McMoneagle really hammers this point. Human memory is selective, right? We forget stuff, we misremember.
Sure.
So, logging everything from a session, even the bits that seem wrong at the time, creates an objective record. It helps you track progress, spot patterns, identify your own biases.
He even talks about a previewing checklist, like getting ready for sports or something.
Kind of. It includes checking basic stuff. Are you hungry, thirsty? Is it noisy? Are you feeling anxious?
Why?
It's all about managing potential interference, creating a calm, focused internal environment so you're actually receptive to the subtle signals. Minimize the static.
Let's go back to targeting for a minute. You mentioned blind targeting. He also talks about double blind. What's the difference and why are they needed?
Okay, so blind targeting means the viewer knows little or nothing about the actual target. This is pretty much essential for any real application, right? To stop their own knowledge or bias from coloring the results.
Right.
Double blind takes it a step further. In that setup, nobody directly involved in running the session knows the target either. Not the viewer, not the monitor or interviewer.
Why do that?
It's the gold standard for research. It eliminates any possibility, even unconscious, of the monitor subtly cueing the viewer. But McMoneagle notes it's often way more complex and expensive to set up, so it's less common in practical operational use.
Can you use remote viewing for the past or the future?
He says targeting past events is definitely possible, often with similar results to present targets.
Right.
But he warns against relying too heavily on any specific dates or times that come through. That seems to be consistently unreliable.
And the future?
For future targets, he advises being very specific about what you're targeting and the time frame. But even then, expect potential bleed through from the near past or near future. And just conceptualizing the future itself seems to be a big hurdle.
In the formal experiments, how did they handle all the data, the notes, the sketches?
Very carefully. Data security was key. Handwritten notes, digital files, all secured. And importantly, in research, they kept everything the viewer produced.
Even the stuff that seemed way off.
Everything. Sketches, notes, random impressions, plus usually a summary sheet for any extra observations during the session. Nothing was thrown away. It was all part of the raw data.
Okay, so if someone listening is intrigued and thinking about maybe trying to develop this,
Yeah.
what's the core advice from McMoneagle?
Repetition and practice, that's number one.
Just keep doing it.
Yeah. And learn to deal with irritations, distractions, set realistic time limits at first, maybe just 15 minutes. Work with blind, random targets, that's crucial. Except that getting super fine details is hard. Focus on the big picture, the main gestalts. Learn from your misses, don't get discouraged, and keep a sense of humor about it.
Don't take it too seriously.
Well, take the process seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously if you get one wrong. And maybe the biggest thing, control your ego. He calls ego the most destructive element.
Exploring this stuff,
Yeah.
it seems like it could really challenge your basic beliefs about how the world works. Does McMoneagle talk about the ethics of introducing people to this?
He does. He feels there's a real ethical responsibility for anyone teaching or introducing remote viewing. You need to provide guidance.
Why?
Because exposure can shift people's philosophical or religious views, sometimes dramatically. He saw it happen. If that's not handled thoughtfully, people can swing to extremes.
What was his own view?
He personally saw a deep connection between what people call God and the fundamental rules of reality, but he advocated for constant skepticism, questioning everything, and not getting rigidly stuck in either faith or current scientific dogma, which also changes over time.
He also mentions dowsing briefly and other ethical points.
Yeah, he sees dowsing as a separate skill, though maybe one that remote viewing practice can enhance. Ethically, he stresses basic privacy. Don't view people without good reason, just like you wouldn't spy on them normally. And definitely avoid using it for things like industrial espionage, trying to steal secrets or ideas.
That makes sense. What about natural talent versus training? Can anyone become an expert viewer with enough work?
He suggests there's a spectrum. For the maybe 1% with truly exceptional natural talent, training helps structure it, but keeping it consistent is tough, and their overall ability might not actually improve much.
Yeah, and for the rest of us.
Yeah.
The other 95%.
For most people, he thinks the focus should be on getting the major impressions, the main characteristics of the target. Getting consistent, fine-grained detail will probably always be inconsistent for most.
He also mentions some actual research findings. The field is sometimes called anomalous cognition, right? What did that research show?
He points to research, like Jessica Utt's work in 96, that basically concluded, yes, anomalous cognition is real. People can access information in ways we don't fully understand.
Okay. Any other specific findings?
A really interesting one is a correlation they found between how strong the effect was and something called local sidereal time, LST.
Sidereal time. Based on the stars.
Yeah, basically. The research, like Spottiswood's in 97, suggested the effect peaked around 13.5 hours LST. Timing experiments for that window could potentially increase the effect size, maybe by as much as 4 times.
Wow, that's specific.
It is. It suggests there might be factors influencing this that we really don't grasp yet, environmental or even cosmological factors.
In his book, appendices have practical stuff too.
Yeah, things like sample timing sheets, protocol examples, and a glossary defining key terms you run into, like signal line, what skepticism means in this context, the role of the subconscious, useful resources.
McMoneagle's own life story in the Stargate Chronicles sounds full of relevant experiences too. Any examples that really stand out?
Oh, definitely. Some of his childhood stuff, like maybe an intuitive link with his twin or recalling a very early surgery, hints at early sensitivity.
Before any training.
Right. Then his experiences in Vietnam, where he felt intuition literally saved his life multiple times. That speaks volumes about the practical value, even untrained.
And later.
His near-death experience, out-of-body events, those really shaped his understanding of consciousness. Then his actual work on intelligence operations, obviously classified, but he describes the types of things they targeted. It shows the real-world stakes.
Like what kind of things?
Situations like the Iran hostage crisis, tracking Soviet submarines, high-level intelligence gathering. His work with the Monroe Institute, exploring altered states, lucid dreaming for RV that connects it to broader consciousness studies.
And he talks about the end of the program and doing it on TV.
Yeah, his reflections on Stargate ending, the challenges, the public perception, and yes, doing live TV remote viewing demonstrations, which had its own set of pressures and implications. All these experiences paint a really rich picture.
So if we were to boil down McMoneagle's overall take on accuracy and reliability, what are the key takeaways?
I think the main things are, it's not a perfect science. Not even close sometimes. Consistency is a real challenge, even for the best viewers. And there are definite limitations, especially with precise timing and exact geographical pinpointing. Be realistic about what it can and can't do.
Okay. So stepping back from this deep dive into McMoneagle's world, we've definitely gone beyond the usual cliches. It's not magic wands, it's structured, protocol-driven, but still pretty mysterious.
It really is. We've looked at the scientific rules, the absolute importance of mental discipline, the traits of a good viewer, and the very real limits. It's way more nuanced than just, having a psychic flash.
It really makes you wonder, though, this blend of strict methodology and something deeply personal, some kind of individual aptitude. What does that really tell us about human consciousness? About how we gather information? Are there these other channels of perception, that maybe we're only just starting to figure out how to tap into systematically?
That's the big question hanging over all of this, isn't it? And when you factor in its history and intelligence, well, that raises a whole other set of questions, ethical ones, about the potential uses and misuses of abilities like this, things we need to think about carefully.
Absolutely. Well, if this conversation has piqued your interest, you really should consider doing your own deep dive. Joseph McMoneagle's books, Remote Viewing Secrets, and the Stargate Chronicles, they offer an incredible first-hand look.
It's a unique perspective, for sure.
A fascinating piece of history, exploring intelligence, consciousness, human potential, all rolled into one.
Well, thank you for joining us on this exploration today. We hope it gave you some new things to think about, maybe a different angle on the whole subject of remote viewing.